Good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the opportunity to come out tonight and learn from these amazing people who have changed the lives of us here today and have changed the lives of people who have not even been born yet. I would like to present a man who has lived a humble life, coming from a father who worked over 30 years in the copper mine, to being superintendent of the Oakland Unified School District, helping forward and develop, improve our schools for young people like me and many others who are thankful for his work. He was in the Unified School District, and he knew that that was not enough. He knew that more needed to be done. In 2004, he was elected to the California State Assembly, where he established an eminence credential for Native American languages to be taught in California schools, and served as chair of the Latino Legislative Caucus, where he worked in getting communities of different races, cultures, and backgrounds together to move forward. A man who knows that the fight is not over. And this election, he's running for state senate to continue the hard work and struggles that will continue to change our state. Ladies and gentlemen, now I present Mr. Joe Cotto.
I think I'm going to try to encourage Stephanie to come down to San Jose and introduce me every day. What about Stephanie? Big round of applause. So we have a very, very exciting program this evening. Some important lessons that we're going to learn that we need to make sure we remember and we continue to pass it on to future generations. So it's a very, very exciting evening. My function is to keep the program moving. I do want to acknowledge, however, that on the back of your program is a list of all of the sponsors. Notice, please, that Kaiser Permanente, if anyone is here from Kaiser, give them a big round of applause right here. And the other sponsors. It's always good to acknowledge our sponsors because that enables these types of programs to continue, and they're so important for building stronger communities. Let me begin by first introducing some elected officials who are in our audience. Hayward City Council Member Olden Henson. Olden, would you please stand? Thank you, Olden, very much. Hayward School Board Member Will McGee is also here. Will, thank you very, very much. Port Commissioner Margaret Gordon has joined us. Commissioner, thank you, Commissioner. And East Bay Regional Park Director Doug Seiden. Doug Seiden, thank you very, very much for joining us. As I said, we have a very, very special evening planned for you today. Let me just highlight why this lecture series is so important. It is dedicated to an exchange of ideas to inspire and move forward new leadership and new service. This is a historic, unprecedented series of lectures that present civil rights leaders who have devoted a lifetime to the timeless lessons of our nation's civil rights movements. Lessons that we must not forget. Lessons that we must continue to remember and learn from and pass them on to future generations. Don't you think that's critical for all of us? Thank you. Now, this year's lecturers all work directly with Dr. Martin Luther King in coordination with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they worked as freedom riders as freedom riders and in voter registration drives in the South. The lecture series recognizes the social justice, the vision, leadership, and accomplishments of two outstanding and dynamic and inspirational leaders of our state and nation. They are, of course, the very honorable and one-of-a-kind champion in our nation, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Give her a big round of applause. Right here. And former assembly member and former mayor, who is unfortunately not able to be with us tonight, former assembly member and mayor Elihu Harris. Let's give him a big round of applause in his absence. Good to be here. It's particularly an honor for me to introduce the organizer, the visionary, the leader of this institute. She had just arrived from the nation's capital, fighting the good fight as she does for all of us. I mean, when I said she is one of a kind, she truly is one of a kind. Amen. She represents all underrepresented people. She represents Latinos and Asians and Native Americans and African Americans. She's a champion for all the people, and there's only one like her. Please welcome Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee.
Well, good evening. First, thank you, Joe, for that very warm introduction. But also, I just have to thank you for your leadership and everything that you're doing to secure the future for our young people. I've met Joe when I was a student at Mills College, and you were on the case then, and that was in the day. And so I just want to thank you so much for staying the course. Give Joe another round of applause. We miss you here in Oakland, too.
He just barely made it.
And let me just, first of all, take a moment. Yeah, let me just say this. I actually had to scramble yesterday to record a video to greet you tonight because, of course, the Republican Tea Party keeps us in chaos in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Okay.
And yes, I just landed. They continue really to try to take us back to the Bush-era days of the economic disaster. But I want you to know, and one of the reasons I wasn't sure if I could get here, because we have, as you know, many, many fights, but we're fighting back big time. We are fighting back.
Thank you.
We are your resistance movement on Capitol Hill.
Yes. All right, all right, all right.
And each and every day, we are fighting for the 99%, for schools instead of prisons, to end this war in Afghanistan, and for economic justice. And let me tell you, we are fighting, but it's because of you that we're able to continue this fight. And so, yeah, you don't have to show the video, because I tell you, they let us out, and I could catch the 3 o'clock fight, but I got to excuse my tennis shoes. But I had to run here. But let me take a moment to thank, of course, Kaiser Permanente for your sponsorship and all of our sponsors. Give them another round of applause, because like Joe said, we couldn't do it without Kaiser and our sponsors. And also Dr. Herring George, and let me thank all of the leadership at Peralta, our Martin Luther King Freedom Center, our amazing young people. Wasn't Stephanie unbelievable? These young people make me very, very proud. And I have to thank Karen and Roy for staying the course and for their important leadership and for really helping put together these very timely lectures, so important at this moment in our history. The Martin Luther King Center was a figment of our imagination in the mid-90s. We started it in East Oakland with 2 individuals who are amazing senior citizens in their 90s now, Mr. Hicks and Charlie Mae Davis. And I just have to honor them tonight because they had the vision when we were struck. I was in the legislature then, and they came to me and they said, we need a Center for Nonviolence and Conflict Resolution, something where our young people can come and learn about environmental studies, learn about the civil rights movement and the human rights movement. So we worked together and put together a memorandum of understanding with the port and the city and the state. And really, the Martin Luther King Center has withstood the test of time. And I just want to thank all of our board and the staff and all of our young people for continuing to make us very proud and continuing to do the work that Mr. Hicks and Charlie Mae Davis really visioned. Because once again, I think this is an example of how dreams can come true. If you have a vision, and if you work to make it happen, it can happen. Yes, we can. So give the MLK Freedom Center another round of applause. And of course, I bring you greetings from my brother Elihu Harris, who could not be with us this evening, but has been so instrumental in these gatherings. And still, as a retiree, he is still working for change in our community. So in his absence, give Elihu a round of applause, because he's doing some amazing work. And these lecture series, they were, once again, a figment of our imagination. And I just have to very briefly share this with you. Every year, I have the privilege to go to Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham with a great warrior for civil rights who will be out here soon, Congressman John Lewis. We march across that Edmund Pettus Bridge. Young people from Oakland and my district come with me, and we go through those 3 days and really begin to understand and learn about what it took just to get the right to vote. You know, what sacrifices our heroes and sheroes made just for justice and freedom. And of course, we still have a long way to go, but I tell you, we would not be here today if it weren't for those heroes and sheroes of the civil rights movement. And so I've had the honor and privilege, and I always share with them that I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. I couldn't go to public schools because I was black. My dad was in the Army, and I can remember wearing his uniform, my dad, my mother, and the 3 girls trying to go to a restaurant to eat and being told, I'm sorry, but we don't serve, and then the N-word was used. Ooh. I can remember not being able to go to drink out of a water fountain unless it said coloreds only. I can remember getting on the train and having to travel in the colored only car. So this is not the too distant past.
That's right.
This was just yesterday.
Yeah. Well,
and I want our young people to understand this was just yesterday.
Yes.
And so I want everyone in my district to be able to go to Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham with me. And we talked about this, Roy and Karen, and again, thank you so much, because we had this dream that, well, maybe we can bring these heroes and sheroes to my district.
Yes.
So that people in my district can get a chance to meet them and learn from them and hear them and see what they went through, just so we could have the right to vote, just so we could move into a neighborhood, any neighborhood, just so we could eat at a restaurant, just so we could go. And I can remember, couldn't even go to a theater, just so we could go to a theater, you know? So these individuals made some major sacrifices and paid the price for African Americans, for Latinos, for Asian Pacific Americans, for all marginalized and disenfranchised people in this country, because their fight for civil and human rights not only was a fight for African Americans, it was a fight for America. It was a fight to make this country stronger and make it live up to its promise of liberty and justice for all. That's what it was about. That's what it was about.
Yeah.
And so I thank you so much for coming out to be part of this. Tonight, we have 2 heroes who made so many sacrifices in our Freedom March in this country. First, Jack Odell, and I met Jack, I don't know, way back in the day. I mean, way back in the day. And he is an international, world-renowned leader who is known all over the world for his work for peace and justice. I've had the privilege to work with Jack Odell on many, many, many occasions. And I just have to say, I've been with him abroad, I've been with him in our own country. And Jack, it is just such an honor and a privilege to know you, to be able to really be with you and to learn from you, and now to have my constituents get a chance to hear you and see you and greet you. So thank you so much for being here. Love you, dear. And during these civil rights pilgrimages, and Bob, I'll see you in a couple of weeks because we're going back with some more of our young people, I had the privilege to meet an unbelievable man whose story is amazing. I've grown to love this man over the last 12 to 13 years. His life has been amazing, and his fight for freedom really has changed the course of history. Bob Zellner, thank you so much for staying the course and for being with us here tonight. It's so good to see you in Oakland. We've been talking about this for at least 12 or 13 years. So I just want to thank them both for taking time out of their very busy schedule to come and meet my constituents, to inform and to inspire us. For we are at another defining moment in our country where bold and decisive action must be taken to rebuild and reignite the American dream. Thank you again. God bless you. It's good to be home.
Come on, let's hear it. Come on now, Barbara Lee.
Thank you, Dave.
You see what I mean? See what I mean? One of a kind, right? One of a kind. We're so fortunate to have Barbara Lee as one of our national leaders. We've also now like to make another introduction, if I may. The person that I will introduce for several years worked as a member of the Oakland School Board, trying to ensure that our youngsters in Oakland receive a quality education. She provided exemplary leadership as a member of the board. From there, she went on to become a member of the Oakland City Council, and provided outstanding leadership in that area, always championing the cause of those who very often are forgotten in our world. Then she was elected as the mayor of the city of Oakland. She's a person that has many, many firsts. The first mayor, the first woman mayor of the city of Oakland. The first, yes. Secondly, the first Asian American mayor in the city of Oakland, and very few in the country. And like many other leaders in our nation, as Barbara Lee was just saying, like many other leaders in our country, having to struggle with the very difficult issues of this global economic downturn and the effects of globalization and just the monumental issues that our leadership has to face. So it's important during these times, I believe, for us to support and encourage and inspire our elected officials to tell them that we're behind them. Please, a big round of applause to the number one elected official in the city of Oakland, the Honorable Mayor Jean Quan. Jean. Jean, want to come and talk to you?
I'm not going to say much because I've been waiting to hear these two heroes too, and I'm always pleased to be with my sister Barbara. And many people may know that my husband and I really started politics and fighting for the Third World Strike at Berkeley and ethnic studies. So sometimes last year, Sandra Swanson and I gave a tour, the walking tour for Oakland, and these kids came up and said, "How do you know so much about Black history?" And I said, you know, Martin Luther King was my hero. There weren't any Asian heroes on TV. And I grew up being the only Chinese kid in my elementary school. And I remember watching those kids walk into Little Rock. And it was good practice, right? Because somebody said, how do you stay calm these days? And I said, you know, there was a time when I was the only Chinese kid in the school, and I had to sort of lift my chin up like those kids did, like Ruby Bridges did, and just keep going. And so,
That's all right.
many of us in the Asian American movement, many of us in all movements, learned from Dr. King and learned from the civil rights issues. And last night I invoked in the State of the Union some surprising people, C.L. Dellums, but also Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, and why we have such an integrated city council today. And some people were surprised at that, but I said, you know, it's about, we're not all angels, we're all not perfect, but the Black Panther Party and Bobby Seale, when he ran for mayor, helped elect the first black mayor, even though it wasn't him, and helped develop district elections so that people, whether they were rich or whether they were people of color, could win the city council race. Because if you can walk to every door, you can win even if you're outspent by $1 million, and that changed politics forever. And so I'm going to shut up. I do want you to look at my 100 block initiative, because as Barbara and I have been saying for years about the Iraq War, there's no peace without justice, so that even we've got some of the troops home, until we really have justice in the neighborhood so every kid in Oakland has hope, there will be no peace in the city. We can't have two Oaklands. Oakland's on the rise, but we must all rise together. Thank you.
That's all right. Oakland's on the rise.
Well done. Gene Kwan.
My pleasure to meet you.
Our mayor. Thank you, Gene, very much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers that we have been waiting for. You're in for a very, very special treat. Very, very special treat. Let me begin first by saying that Jack Odell has devoted a long and healthy life. I'm going to, by the way, they asked me to look at this resume, and it was so comprehensive that it was very difficult to leave something out. So please bear with me, because I do want to highlight how special these individuals are. He has devoted a long and healthy life to the struggles to form a more perfect union and a better world. His discipline and devotion led him into major areas of struggle in the United States, including union organizing, civil rights mobilizing, tenant organizing, peace mobilization, and disarmament mobilizing. He began organizing when he was in the National Maritime Union during and after World War II. He worked with Dr. King as a director of voter education at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He has consulted on 2 U.S. presidential campaigns and served Operation Push and the National Rainbow Coalition for over 20 years as the Director of International Affairs. He wrote for and edited the historic journal Freedom Ways for several years. He has also taught at Antioch University. He has traveled around the globe as a worker, a representative of progressive U.S. organizations, and as a brother to all in struggle. His experiences, intense study, discipline, and his warmth and humor have provided tens of thousands with a deep sense of joy and optimism for the future of humanity. He understands a better world is possible, and he has great advice for anyone attempting to bring a better world into being. He currently consults, he writes, and speaks to organizations around the world. He resides with his wife, Jane Power, in Vancouver, British Columbia. We are honored to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Jack Odell, a champion of social justice.
Sit down up here.
Hello, Jack.
do the second introduction?
Yeah,
Okay.
please do. Yeah.
Maybe that might be better. Let me do the second introduction. Hold on a second. Wait. I want to make sure that
Sure, that's right.
this is very special. We want to treat
Yes,
it with
sir.
the utmost of respect. Our next speaker was born and raised in southern Alabama. He taught at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee and became the first white Southerner to serve as field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was arrested 18 times in 7 states. He organized from Mississippi to New Haven and from Boston to Baton Rouge. In Danville, Virginia, he was charged with, and I quote, inciting the black population to acts of war and violence against the white population, end of quotes. During the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, he traveled with Rita Schwerner while taking part in SNCC's, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's investigation of the disappearance of her husband, Mickey, and James Chaney and Andrew Goodman. Bob played an active role in the Southern Conference Educational Fund to organize an ongoing anti-racism project for black and white workers in the Deep South called GROW, grassroots organizing work. And I might want to comment that there was a multi-ethnic effort, Latinos and African Americans and Asians and white people, everyone working together for a common cause. He received his PhD in history from Tulane University. He's taught at Rosemont College, Pennsylvania, and Southampton College. In 2005, he was a featured civil rights luminary in the award-winning documentary, Come Walk in My Shoes, about the congressional civil rights pilgrimage that our congressman talked about, that was led by Congressman John Lewis. The pilgrimage visits Selma, Alabama, and other sites of the freedom struggle. His memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, a white Southerner in the freedom movement, was published by New South Books in November of 2008. Again, we are honored to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Bob Zellner, a champion for social justice.
Now I can go. No, it's all good. Thank you. So I just start talking, huh? I can hear myself. Oh, boy, this is all right. Well, I'm delighted to be here this evening and to see all of you. This is my first time in Oakland, but I have, over the years, been aware of how important Oakland and California have been to our history as far as the struggle for justice and peace and democracy is concerned. I remember when being in college in New Orleans, how at the time of World War II, so many people left that city to come to the shipyards in Oakland. I remember Paul Robeson's many visits here. He was a member of our union, honorary member of our union, the National Maritime Union. I'm indebted to the fact that there was a general strike in San Francisco that gave birth to the NMU. And the NMU, as my union, was an educator for me as far as understanding the world. And then there is this contribution that California has made in general to the struggle for justice across the world, across our nation. Gus Hawkins, the author of the Humphrey Hawkins Bill in the 1970s, that insisted upon the federal government maintaining a 4% unemployment rate. Ron Dellum's single-payer health care legislation that was introduced in the late 70s. We have not achieved either of these things some 35 years later, but California representatives were responsible for this effort being made, and that is some of our unfinished business. And then there was the Berkeley free speech movement that puts the House on American Activities out of business. I'm here to say thanks to them. I'm especially happy to be on this program with Brother Bob Zellner, who courageously has been part of our struggle for peace and justice over the years. He represents a rich legacy to all of us and a standard bearer of our movement in difficult times. He has traveled, and over several decades, we have come to appreciate the great contribution that he has made. And I'm grateful also to Congresswoman who has, well, she has inspired so much of us in the stand that she took with regard to the Iraq War. And it is a challenge to us to recognize that this war continued in any case, and we spent 10 years and close to $1 billion. We spent 8 years and close to $1 trillion for a war that in the early stages was said that our reason for going was wrong. But there was not the will to get out of there and save lives. And that example is very much to us a lesson as to what the nature of our struggle is today. I want to say a few words tonight about the importance of organization and how the clarity comes from it in difficult times. I guess my talk would be called When This Time is Named. Students of the role of social movements in history often feel compelled to identify periods in which events shape a particular time frame of development. An attempt is made to name a period of history or an age as a way of expressing the significance of the events in a compact way. So we speak of the Age of Enlightenment, the 18th century time of the... I'm going to get up here. I think I'm going to stand up here. Do a little better here.
Good. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I want to
The
see
energy's
y'all.
getting to go now. Good.
I didn't know how this worked, Roy. I mean, I didn't realize that I could be up here too. I thought I had to be seated. You know me. So I'll start again. Students of the role of social movements in history often feel compelled to identify periods in which events shape a particular time frame of development. An attempt is made to name a period in history or an age as a way of expressing the significance of the events in a compact way. So we speak of the Age of Enlightenment, the 18th century time of the American and French revolutions, or an era of time and place which allows us to identify and organize a comprehensive interpretation of events that separate one period from another. So we have something called the Jazz Age of the 1920s, the Great Depression of the 30s, or an age called Black Reconstruction, as Dr. Du Bois identified in a history, the part black folk made in the attempts to reconstruct democracy in America. The First World War has been called the Great War, which was meant to imply that it was the last war to be fought, as people hoped, because of the many destructive weapons that found their first use in that war, a war in which 19 million people were killed. Or sometimes in the writing of biography, people will identify a personality as the leading force in its period, such as the age of Jackson. That's Andrew, not Jesse. They are assigning the period to a personality that is viewed as having great significance to the creation of a larger picture of change. In the 1940s, humanity's victory over fascism in the Second World War and all of the implications that had held for new possibilities for freedom and democracy to flourish was captured in the designation, the century of the common man. So my remarks this evening, titled When This Time Is Named, are meant to express the significance of this period in which we are living, as well as the changes, directions, realignments, and hopes that will at some point become a part of the ability to define this period in a comprehensive way. I should add that this title was borrowed from a title by the women's movement of Morocco on the occasion of the International Conference of the Women's Movement in Beijing in 1995. The singularly attractive and most significant feature of any movement that is affecting profound change in society is the role it plays in creating a dual authority in the country. It is the authority of the movement as the people's response to the policies of the established authority, which gives the movement this power to ultimately affect a democratic transformation of society. Beginning with the events of Montgomery in 1955, when the African American community of 50,000 citizens stood as one in a bus boycott against segregation, and extending to 1969 with the Vietnam moratorium to stop the war, in which an estimated 4 million people participated. During this 14-year period, our movement created a dual authority in the country. There was, on the one hand, the established authority, the citadel of institutionalized racism, the masters of war, and the economic plunder. But now there was also the dual authority of our movement, created out of sacrifice, determination, and a clear vision of our goals, human rights and peace in all of their dimensions. This initiative had its roots and point of reference, the high hopes in our nation at the end of the Second World War in 1945. The most destructive war in history had come to an end, and the world was prepared to experience a new birth of freedom as a number of countries under colonialism were articulating their determination to be free. A World Federation of Trade Unions had been formed, and my union, the National Maritime Union, was one of those unions that affiliated with the World Federation of Trade Unions. This was the largest seamen's union in the United States, and it was a member. The GI Bill of Rights had been passed by Congress under President Roosevelt's request as an expression of our nation's appreciations of the great sacrifices our troop had made in cooperation with the troops of other allied countries in defeating fascism in Europe and Japan. In the summer of 1945, a concert was held in Indianapolis by Duke Ellington, in which he introduced a tone poem called New World A-Comin'. And he explained it as an effort to express, quote, all the good things that are ahead to be enjoyed. The international community that was finding new forms of organization, such as the World Federation of Democratic Women under Mrs. Courton of France, and a similar one among the scientists, these international organizations were adopting the vision that was ahead of us, the century of the common man. But corporate America, flush with war profits from the defense industry and bent on gaining ownership of the expanded production facilities that our tax dollars had paid for during the war, also had a vision of the post-war world. This vision was expressed in the editorial pages of Life magazine as the American century. As we were to learn through a decade of McCarthyism that followed, this was meant as a substitute vision of the new world, which America's wealth, military capacity, and the respect it had gained in World War II would be used to project. The Cold War was a counter-revolution and was a form of deception carefully cultivated as a cover for implementing this vision. African Americans, on the other hand, saw the larger vision adopted by the international community consistent with their own aspirations when we adopted the Double V campaign against fascism and victory at home and institutional racism abroad. In other words, we were all in favor of, as many of you know, gaining a victory over fascism abroad, but we have a double victory because we had a victory at home in our mind because that was equally important. This commitment to this vision had been enhanced by massive numbers of our folks who had left the South during the early 40s to take jobs in defense plants in the northern and western states like California, Ohio, and Michigan, where our political rights were more respected. The movement then was around such questions as getting President Roosevelt's wartime Executive Order 8803, abolishing discrimination in hiring in defense plants during the war, to be applied to all government-financed economic activity in the post-war period. This took the form of getting state legislatures in the northern states to pass fair employment practices, FEPC you might have heard of, laws with teeth in them. Then came the Powell Amendment, initiated by Congressman Adam Powell from New York, one of the only two African-American members of Congress at that time. This said any federal support to states that must have a Fair Employment Practices Code attached to that legislation. These victories in the North were in general won by a coalition between groups like the NAACP and the Urban League with major labor unions such as those in the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organization, which before the mid-50s had not yet united with the AFL to form a new organization. When the Montgomery movement surfaced in the South around the bus boycott in 1955, this was a qualitative shift that announced that a new center of organized activity had emerged in the South as well, the heartland of institutionalized racial segregation. Furthermore, it had emerged in a city that had been the headquarters of the Southern Confederacy 100 years earlier, and the movement was being led by a young preacher who was a Hegelian philosopher and a third-generation member of the National Baptist Convention, the largest black religious organization in the country. This new movement had broken with simply relying upon the important work that lawyers had been doing in the courts, but had also adopted as its main emphasis the mobilization of the population for nonviolent direct action. In this movement, the lawyers would be dedicated supporters of the movement's strategy and tactics rather than shaping the totality of the design of the initiative. Another ingredient incorporated into this new character was the shaping of an independent, informed opinion towards world affairs and events happening at that time. The Bandung Conference held in Indonesia had made up some 29 countries, recently independent from colonialism, adopted a position of non-alignment in relation to the Cold War. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell and the novelist Richard Wright were the only two Americans in attendance at that historic event. Paul Robeson's monthly magazine, Freedom, regularly reported on the growing anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the fight against the pass laws, and his wife, Eslanda Robeson, a social scientist in her own right, was an honorary member of the Fourth Committee on Decolonization in the United Nations, and frequently wrote articles in other organs of the black press. This tradition of being interested in events around the world was relatively cultivated in the black press during the days as early as fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in the mid-1930s. This movement was a proliferation of centers busy with activists planning strategy, recruiting volunteers, raising bail for those arrested for exercising their constitutional right to protest injustices, and above all, organized and aroused to action. In this many-sided collective activity, untold numbers of our fellow citizens had made personal decisions on how they would allow how they would allow the movement to affect the routines of their everyday life. The kinds of decisions were varied, whether to leave one's job in order to work in the movement, whether to dedicate earned vacation time or drop out of school for a semester to do full-time organizing, or give the family car to organizers and find other ways to get to work. Some put up their property as bail bond, an expression of their confidence in the integrity and inevitability of victory of our movement. Teachers volunteered to run freedom schools in the communities after school hours to help students broaden out their vision and understanding of the times in which we were living. Many lawyers donated talented legal services, helping to work out routine legal problems. Church work versus work of the church. On Sunday, we gathered to do church work, that is, take care of the deacons and so forth. And on Monday evenings, the movement met. That was work of the church. In the years between these points of reference, the authority of the people's movement in the country was crystallized and made evident in the hundreds of local demonstrations in cities across the country. One of them, on one occasion, our movement mobilized tens of thousands, on more than one occasion, our movement mobilized tens of thousands of people in demonstrations on Boston Commons and Soldiers Field in Boston Commons, or in Soldiers Field in Chicago, and in the streets of Detroit and San Francisco and New York and elsewhere. In addition to the historic marches in Washington in 1963 and 67, our last confrontation at the Pentagon with 100,000 people. The restoration of the dual authority of the mass movement is critical to the solution of the many problems of great magnitude that our country faces today. When Dr. Martin Luther King was recovering from an attempted assassination in 1958 in New York, a reporter asked him, "What does your movement seek to accomplish?" And Dr. King's reply was, "We seek a nation at peace with itself, a nation at peace with its own conscience."
Yeah.
And so we have a moment in time in which consciousness comes into play. Some of you remember Fannie Lou Hamer saying, "I'm tired of being sick and tired." Mm-hmm. Albany, Georgia in 1962 filled the jails. They didn't say which thing they wanted desegregated. They wanted everything desegregated. "Oh, Pritchard, you never can jail us all." That was the song they sang. In Birmingham, they had decided that we are already in jail. Segregation is jail. So they were no longer free. They were no longer afeared of jail. Freedom now. That was the issue that was raised there. And Max Roach put it into a theme. Freedom now, sweet. In Detroit, 125,000 people marched with Dr. King in June of 1963. Freedom now. And another 250,000 marched in August in Washington. Freedom now. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This is an awakening. We see everything in a different light. There are those moments in time when that does happen. Aretha Franklin spelled it out, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. 3 Buddhist monks set themselves afire in self-immolation to protest the presence of the United States and what it was doing in the armies and villages across Vietnam, claiming they were burning the villages down to get at the Viet Cong. But there are moments when the fire becomes light. Congress decided to hold hearings and find out why we were there in the first place, why we were there. As a matter of conscience, we must remind ourselves that military aggression has extended from Grenada, the Dominican Republic, and Panama in this hemisphere to Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Asia. The worldwide goodwill that we inherited from Second World War and our contribution has been seriously deteriorated, because none of these countries we have invaded since the Second World War is responsible for our present predicament. We have built, and appropriately so, a monument to the young American men and women who died in the Vietnam War. But we must ask ourselves, where is the monument to the Vietnamese patriots who died for the independence of their country? Independence from France as a colonial power in 1954. They won that independence war, but they had to engage in a second war of independence thanks to the U.S. policy not recognizing the legitimacy of their victory over their colonial status under France. And the anemia of our democracy is reflected in the fact that this foreign policy of aggression has not yet ceased, but rather has at one time or another been endorsed and proceeds under the hegemony of both major parties. In fact, too often, this kind of activity is promoted, war that is, as defense. And at least since the Second World War, we have associated a military defense buildup with jobs as a solution to an unemployment problem. This is a profoundly negative influence in our national culture, and it is in the national interest of a mature democracy to work tirelessly to overcome this assault upon the national conscience. The electoral coalition, which brought victory to the American people in the election of President Obama, has the capacity to become a movement, and indeed it has the mandate of history to do so. What the people of the United States in a clear majority elected was not only an affirmation of our best hopes for the future, it is important to note that it also closed the door momentarily to a bid for power by a much darker spirit in the American experience. This magnificent moment is ours to preserve and extend, but it will not remain so without our concerted and sustained attention. Monopoly capitalism leads to war for raw materials and cheap labor. Monopoly capitalism and war leads to poverty, greed-driven policies to increase profits. Monopoly capitalism plus war plus poverty leads to the destruction of our communities, criminal enterprises, and despair. Racism is a major ingredient in each of these stages. In the American experience, the movement against war and the movement against racism merged and gave us our greatest achievements in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s decades. Millions of people around the world today embrace "We Shall Overcome" as the anthem of their struggle. They do not attach the same merit to "God Bless America" or the national anthem, Star Spangled Banner. For too often, they may have experienced rockets' red glare and bombs bursting over there, being Americans, bursting over their country. So they take our song as an anthem. That's those songs as the anthem of an empire. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Speaks of a shared desire to be friends, allies in a common struggle for a better world. Let us embrace this invitation and vision as the opportunity of a lifetime to save our planet and our earthly home from the ravages of corporate greed. Let us commit ourselves to make these changes, whatever time and effort it takes. It takes some giant steps, as John Coltrane calls it, to bring about a democracy that is large, generous, and earns the respect of the world. Venceremos.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad everybody had an opportunity to stand up and stretch a little bit. My name is Bob Zellner, and I grew up in L.A., Lower Alabama. And when I see Congresswoman Barbara Lee, I always think of Alabama because we spent more time in Lower Alabama than we have in liberated Oakland, but I sure am happy to be here tonight. When I see your faces tonight, when I see this wonderful congregation, it reminds me that people who I've been friends with for a long time, I always kind of want to go to their house, and I like to think of them in a place, in their crib, in their house where they belong. So this is where the Congresswoman belongs, and I will always feel different now that I've been to your house. This house that we have built together is a strong house. It's a community. And even though many of us haven't met before, when I see you, I know you. I see into you. I see into your heart. I see into your struggle. It wasn't always that way with me growing up in Lower Alabama. My father was a Klansman, was in the Ku Klux Klan. My grandfather was in the Ku Klux Klan. My mother and father were both graduates of Bob Jones College, which is now Bob Jones University. And many of the old heads will tell the younger people what the significance of that is. Bob Jones University in South Carolina now is not known as a hotbed of Southern progressivism or liberalism. I'm named for Bob Jones. Bob Jones did the wedding ceremony for my mother and father. So when I say that my mother and father come from a fundamentalist Christian background and my father and my grandfather were in the Klan, you might say that I come from a long line of fundamentalist terrorists. We're concerned today with fundamentalism and terrorism around the world. And that's a phenomenon that says inside of our group, if you belong with us, I will protect you, I will not harm you. But if you're outside my group, you're the infidel. I may not only have the right to harm you, I may have a religious responsibility to harm you. That's an idea that has crept back into our nation after the wonderful civil rights movement that made us a community to begin with. I was very lucky that my father was able to break with the Ku Klux Klan. And when my father left the Klan, his father disowned him and never did he speak another word with his own blood brothers. His brothers never spoke to him again in his life because he had left the brotherhood of the Klan, because my father had opened his horizons. He had gone to Europe, actually, right before the Second World War with Bob Jones, with the cockamamie idea that they would save the Jews of Europe by converting them to be Christians. And I remember saying to my father, Jack, I said, did you convert any Jews? And he said, no, but they converted me. So consequently, in my early years, my mother was so happy when my father left the Ku Klux Klan that she took his white robes and cut them up and made white shirts for us to go to Sunday school in. She was very happy. My father became a Methodist minister and began to fight in the struggle for freedom. Worked with Joe Lowry in the SCLC. He became a colleague of Dr. King's. And now when I do research on our movement and I find letters from my father, Reverend James Abraham Zellner, to Martin Luther King, I feel that we were able, because of his courage, to break with the Klan. We were able to become true human beings and a part of the universe.
That's quite true.
When I grew up in Alabama, it was very unlikely then that I would ever become a part of the civil rights movement. But luckily, I went to college in Montgomery, Alabama, which we'll be in Montgomery the 2nd through the 6th, I think, on a great reenactment in Selma and in Montgomery and Birmingham of that great movement that we take as a touchstone. Not only do we take that as a touchstone, but struggling peoples around the world now, as Jack said, relate to We Shall Overcome. They look to our movement as a way of stimulating their own movement, and that in turn stimulates us. Why do you think there was an Arab Spring? And why do you think there's an Occupy movement now in the United States? It's because we energize each other with what? Freedom. The idea of freedom. So I want to tell you just a little bit, and if the older people won't mind for a minute, I'd like to talk to all the young people here, all the high school students, all the college students. And I want to tell you how it was 50 years ago when I grew up in Alabama, never having the opportunity to ever attend a single integrated classroom from the time I started first grade in Slocum, Alabama, to the time I graduated college in Montgomery, Alabama in 1961. Never attended an integrated class. Now, the reason for that was that there was strict segregation in the South, and that was based on the history of our country. And when I look at this audience tonight, and I see the multicolors, when we talked about in those days black and white, we now talk about black and white, Latino, Asian, gay, straight, women, men, progressives, who are joining together in a kind of a crusade. And the reason we have to have this is that those forces that enforced segregation when I grew up are constantly coming back at us. The women's movement was tremendously successful in this country. After the civil rights movement, it was re-energized again, and they are pushing back every day. Can you imagine a major party in our political structure indicating that they want to go back to Roe versus Wade? Do you think that they really think that the majority of the people in this country are supporting that? I don't think they think that, but they think that 1/3 of our country in a right-wing direction can wag the rest of the country, and we say no, don't we? That's what I was able to say when in Montgomery, young people. I was in a senior level sociology course, and we were assigned a paper. This was a course in race relations. And we were assigned a paper to write about the racial problem and to write our paper about solutions to the problem. Now, we all knew that there was a problem. Many people claimed they couldn't see it. But if you were a Christian, if you had any ounce of human kindness in your soul, you could see that there was tremendous inequality in the South based on race. And when we studied our high school history, we could already tell that a major moral compromise was made with our founding documents. We were for equality, we were for religious freedom and so forth. And what do? We enshrined in our original documents the inhumanity of certain people based on characteristics of skin color. That was a moral compromise that we made from the beginning, and it has continued to stain our society upright until today. So when we were given this assignment, 5 of us in the class told our professor, we want to go and talk to Martin Luther King and Mrs. Rosa Parks and Mr. E.D. Nixon, who made the Montgomery bus boycott. That's a way of solving some of the racial problems. Haven't they integrated the buses right here in Montgomery, Alabama? And our professor said, you can't do that. And we said, why not? He said, you'll be arrested. Well, our imagination was piqued by the idea that we could be arrested doing research for a paper. And our professor said, yes, in 1959 in Montgomery, you can. That was the beginning of my education. And I was already a senior. I had gone through almost all of my college, and my education was just beginning. Well, we went to federal court, because in federal court, you can meet on an equal basis. And if you wanted to see Dr. King in those days, you always went to court. You could find him there on one or another charge. So the 5 of us, we went up to Dr. King, and we introduced ourselves, and we said, we're doing this paper in college, and we'd like to come to hear you speak. We understand you're going to speak at Reverend Abernathy's church next Saturday, and there's going to be some people there from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, John Lewis and other people who had made the lunch counter sit-ins and who would soon be involved in the freedom rides. So he said, yes, we'd be very happy to have you come, but you might be arrested. So we said, Dr. King, that's what our professor said. He said, that's why he's a professor. He's smart, very smart about those things. So he had a little workshop there with us. And so we said, well, we're going to go anyway. So actually we could not believe, even growing up in the South, that you couldn't at least go and investigate. Yeah. We're not taking a position one way or another. But so we went to Reverend Abernathy's church, and sure enough, at the end of this wonderful day, Dr. King came over, and I swear he was grinning with a little twinkle in his eye, and he said, the police have surrounded the building, and they've sent word that you're going to be arrested, all 5 of them. So I said, Dr. King, we need to escape. So he laughed again. He said, well, you remember that little workshop we had that if you were going to come, you better be ready to be arrested. And I said, well, what we really mean is that we need to try to escape because we don't want to get our parents in trouble. We don't want to get our school in trouble. We were that revolutionary, right? We were little bitty revolutionaries. And we just wanted to take a little bit of risk. But anyway, he said, I tell you what. Now, this is one of the aspects of Dr. King that I came to admire and love. First of all, he wasn't Saint Martin Luther King at that time, and neither was Mrs. Parks, Saint Rosa Parks. They were ordinary people with tremendous courage, tremendous courage. And I was very privileged that they thought enough of us, little college students, that they really took us under their wing and became mentors to us. So Dr. King said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. Why don't I go out the front door, and Reverend Abernathy and Mrs. Parks can take you down to the basement. And those of you who've been in that church, and we always go on the Faith and Politics tour, and we'll be there in a couple of weeks, next month actually, took us down to the basement, and as we were waiting for the signal from Dr. King to come that he had gone out the front, Mrs. Parks, that quiet granite woman of great faith, simply said to me, she put her hand on my elbow. I've never washed that elbow since then, by the way. She said, Bob, when you see something wrong, you have to do something about it. You cannot study it forever. So that's what I tell students now. I tell students now, you have to take a risk. You have to have something that you can take a risk for. That was a very small risk, but thank goodness we did that, because it led me into a life of crime. I was arrested 18 times, joined the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the rest is history. But how could you not respond to someone who said that, simply stated? So sure enough, Dr. King went out the front, and the police and the news people they all ran to the front, thinking that we'd be right behind Dr. King. And so they all kind of patted us on the back. They opened the door, and the funniest thing you've ever seen is 5 little white boys running all out through the black community in Montgomery, Alabama. The beginning of a heroic civil rights career, running from our own police, right? But I learned a great lesson that night. If you step over their lines, you can go suddenly from being the most privileged class in the history of the world, a white Southern male, middle class, private school. All of a sudden, we had crossed what? The segregation boundary. We had declared ourselves to be somewhat out of sync with the Southern way of life. As a result of that, you could not imagine, young people, that the Klan burnt crosses around our dormitory. When we finally got back to campus, we escaped. We got back to campus. We were met by the whole administration of our college. And just because you have leaders right here in your college, you know, that stand up and take a stand, we didn't have it then. So our college professor said, you have to resign from school. You have broken the segregation law. You've disgraced our school. You have to resign from school. The next night, the Klan marched in its hundreds in uniform, burned a 38-foot cross right down the campus from Huntington College, and called out the Huntington Five. They said, we will track you down, we will get you, and you will be lynched for what you are doing. We were then called into the office of the Attorney General of the state of Alabama, and he said, you have fallen under the communist influence. I said, you mean there's communists in Alabama?
You sure were.
He said, no, but they come through here. And I'm with one of them tonight who was coming through. Jack Odell was one of the great mentors of us as young people. You know, he used to be a lot older than me, and now I've gotten a lot older than him. No. I don't know. I don't know how he did it, but I passed him somewhere along the way. See, there was always, whatever movement that you come to, there's always predecessors. When I was in school, I didn't learn about the Lincoln Brigade. When I was in school, I didn't learn about the great labor movement in this country and the socialists and others, the communists, who made that movement, who prepared a ground for the civil rights movement, prepared a ground for the women's movement, for the union struggle. We didn't learn that. We hardly ever got up to the Second World War. And if you remember your high school history, I don't know if you got to the Vietnam War. But all those things are imbued with what has followed us all of our history. Growing up in the South, I realized that I was a member of a group of people who suffered from shriveled heart syndrome. You know, and I realized that the liberation that I felt when I joined John Lewis, and when I joined Jack Odell, and Dr. King, and Mrs. Rosa Parks, and E.D. Nixon, and the great stalwarts who were making that movement, I learned that that was a liberating experience to me, and it allowed me to have the milk of human kindness once more in my heart. If I was required to support segregation and required to support the oppression of people based on their race, their nationality, their religion, the color of their skin, their sexual identity, all of those things, I would continue to shrivel my heart. So today, thank you. Today in this country, the stronghold of the Republican right-wing movement is still in the Deep South and pockets of poison in the Middle West and a few other places. Not liberated territory right here. Now, we know that we have some problems right here, but you have a community that has a history of struggle. I want to give a shout out to Brother Huey P. Newton, to Brother Bobby Seale, Tupac Shakur. Tupac! All right. I want to give a shout out to Frank Wilkerson. I want to give a shout out to Jessica Mitford, Bob Truhoff, the many great revolutionaries from this area right here. And I know a lot of it comes from our own area of the Deep South. Where do you think Huey P. Newton got his name? He's from Louisiana, named after Huey P. Long. Huey Pierce Long, the populist governor of Louisiana, that said that poor people should get together. Black people, poor people should get together. They still had a lot of racist content in that populism. We have to develop a populism and a politics in this country that does not have the impetus always and the power in the hands of the white people. And if you look at this audience tonight, we have a strong movement. We have a strong community now with the leadership and the impetus and the control in the hands of people of color, women's people who have made the women's struggle, the new gay, lesbian, bi, transsexual movement of freedoms, the Latino struggle, the brown struggle, the Native Americans. The last time I was arrested, I think I'll have to say 19 now, I used to say 18, was just a few years back in Southampton, New York. When I moved from Alabama, I moved to Up South.
That's right.
I moved to Southampton, New York, and I was appointed, being an old hand, I was appointed to be on the anti-bias task force for Southampton, New York. That's in the Hamptons. I don't know if you've heard of it or not.
Oh, yeah.
You heard of Malibu? Well, we were Malibu East, I guess. Right? So, and there's two poor people out there. Derek Thomas, my housemate. Derek, raise your hand. Me and Derek. We know there's two poor people there because we're in the struggle. We never made any money, but we made a lot of noise. But anyway, that was a situation where the developers were so intent on building houses right up to the edge of and encroaching on the Shinnecock Nation reservation that they were bulldozing the graveyard, the Native American graveyard, the ancestral burial ground of the Shinnecock Nation. And they called me down to try to mediate between the Shinnecock Nation and the state troopers. And as I was trying to say to the troopers, there's a temporary restraining order, and it's on the way down here. And the trooper says, yes, we know that's been gotten, but we've got to knock down some more of these trees, and we got to root up some more of these bushes and everything before they get there. They were trying to make it a fait accompli to destroy the whole graveyard before the temporary restraining order. And I said, you can't do that. And at that moment, I was tackled from behind. There's a picture in my memoir of that. I was 62 years old, and when they had me down on the ground, they broke this elbow right here. And I thought, well, I'm too old for this. But you know, once in the struggle, and if you are a long distance runner, you may have to go to that jail again, you know. But I'll tell you this, when I was in the jail, locked up, chained to metal benches with the Native Americans that were arrested with me, Those state troopers, not Alabama state troopers, but New York state troopers, came over to us whooping and shouting about the Diallo decision. Do you remember Mr. Diallo, the African who was shot 40 times in New York by the police? That day, the decision came down that they would not even be charged. They would never be tried for shooting the man 40 times, one of the most blatantly racist incidents that had occurred. They were not to be. So those state troopers came over to us and taunted us as we were chained to those metal benches, and they said, "You want the warpath? The next time we come to the reservation, we will bring our Winchesters. Nothing will happen to us. We can slaughter you all, and we will not even be charged with a crime." Now, that's state troopers. What is the mentality of state troopers? What does it say about their leadership structure? What does it say about the strange place of racism still in our culture? You know? And I just talked to someone from Bulgaria at one of our lectures, and she said she went back to Bulgaria after an 11-year absence, and she was shocked at the amount of racism in Bulgaria. And so I said, "Well, I don't think there's very many black people in it." She said, "No, but there's racism and homophobia rampant in Bulgaria against the gays and against the gypsies." So it's something in the human heart that pulls us between brotherhood and sisterhood and wanting to get at each other's throats. We've had enough struggle in this country so that when we organize, and Jack is very true about this, when you organize, you have to make that dedication that no matter what happens, you're going to stick to the cause. When I first joined SNCC in 1961, and I'm going to stop here so we can have some discussion, within 36 months of me joining the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, 5 of my friends and colleagues were murdered by racists. 5 of them were lynched and killed by racists. So think of you after you finish your college and you get your job. Unless you're going to go into the military or on the police force or maybe the firemen or so forth, you probably would not expect that 5 of your friends and colleagues within 3 years would be murdered in the line of duty. That's what it took in the days of the early civil rights movement. And that's why I was very privileged to know Dr. King. And on this Black History Month, and sitting here with you all in this wonderful lecture series that's been brought, the fact that we can come and we can bring our stories and we can hear your stories, it means that I learned very valuable lessons from my mentors, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And that is that brotherhood and sisterhood is not so wild a dream as those who profit by postponing it pretend. So get to work. Thank you.
Beautiful, brother. Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Come on.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Come on, you got to do better than that. How about these presentations? Please.
Thank you.
Got to do better than that.